Well, among the questions that just won't go away is how much did the BBC know about Jimmy Savile's behaviour at the height of the abuse in the 70s and 80s? A former Radio 1 producer has told this programme that Savile openly boasted about having sex with 3 14-year-old girls and says the boast was made in front of a senior member of staff. Porrick O'Brien has looked into the allegation and put the claims to the people in charge at the time.
It's Jimmy. We've spoken to the BBC bosses who worked with Savile during the 70s when he was abusing young girls. Some just heard the rumours. Others heard him admit to sex with 14-year-olds. The reaction at the time? That's just Jimmy. We've tried to cut through the corporate winks and whispers of the time to look at an example where someone raised a flag over Savile's behaviour and to try and trace that concern up the corporate food chain. In the late 70s, a young producer at BBC Radio 1 was the first to play anarchy in the UK on the radio. Richard Pearson was a rising star and was invited to meet Savile with a senior producer of a young person's discussion programme called Speakeasy.
I went up to a meeting which was held, an informal meeting, held in the restaurant at Broadcasting House with Jimmy Savile and a senior producer in the religious broadcasting department called David Winter. And at that meeting, Jimmy Savile was doing like his comedy presenter routine, and one of the things he said, not particularly quietly, was that he'd had 3 14-year-old girls in his trailer that morning. And when he said had, he didn't mean they'd come to, you know, criticise his curtains. He meant he'd had sex with them.
He just openly said that out in the restaurant?
He openly said that. He said it kept him young. And I'd only literally just started there, and I was pretty shocked by it, but I found it quite repulsive.
And how did the senior producer react?
He looked embarrassed, and obviously after the meeting had ended, we went back to the office and I said, how you know, can he be like that? How can he, you know, say things like that? Asked him what he knew, and he told me he knew quite a bit, and it was common knowledge around the BBC that Savile had sex with underage girls. He said he'd spoken to him about it and asked him how it sat with his professed Roman Catholic faith, and Jimmy Savile, he said, told him that he didn't really understand. He, Savile, had a relationship with the man upstairs who basically allowed him to do things like that because of all the work he did for charity.
He refused to work with Savile. But what of the senior producer at the BBC's Religious Affairs Department, David Winter? He went on to become head of the department, eventually trained as a priest, became a canon and regular contributor to Radio 4's Thought for the Day.
It's time for Thought for the Day, and the speaker in our Oxford studio this morning is Canon David Winter. Good morning.
Good morning.
He doesn't remember the meeting with Pearson, says he never saw evidence of Savile's inappropriate behaviour, but went on to say everyone knew.
I wasn't arranging a programme in which girls were molested, but I did know that there was a danger that was going on. The next level corporately was also they do a great deal more than I did. I only worked with him on one radio programme, you know. He was a television
Did you say
star.
that the next level up corporately knew more than you did? Who was that?
And I assume, I can only assume, that the heads of channels and the had some idea that there were questions about Jimmy Savile's behaviour. I'm sure there were.
Who do you think should have done what at the time?
I'm not sure that that's an answerable question, because that was then, and we're looking at it through the perspective of now. But the responsibility for the care of the youngsters who came to see the programmes and so on would have been ultimately the responsibility of the controller of BBC One. I mean, they were coming into
Derek Chinnery.
It was Derek Chinnery then, yes.
Derek Chinnery was the king of BBC Radio 1 during the 70s. one of the old gentleman broadcaster generation, and Jimmy Savile's boss. He told me he hadn't heard the rumours, so I asked him another question.
Was safeguarding children on your radar at that time as controller of Radio 1?
Well, you put me in an awkward position. If I say no, it'll sound as if I didn't care. But it wasn't, there was no reason why I should have take any special, or place any special consideration as far as protecting young children.
Nowadays, that sounds quite hard to understand.
Well, I find it hard to understand that you think it's hard to understand, because I mean, you run a radio station, you employ presenters, they come in, you see them, you talk to them, you discuss the way you want the programmes done, and they do their job.
Chinnery was genuinely shocked by the Savile revelations and says he did not see or hear evidence of abuse. But it happened, and a culture at the time let it. Everyone we've spoken to says of the time, that's just the way it was. But that's just the way it was inside a small media bubble. For the mothers and fathers of those abused, they didn't know that that's just the way it was.